It is late February right now, pushing into March, and waking up this morning, you can just feel it. There is this heavy, undeniable static tension in the air. It is that strange transition between winter and spring, but the unease goes way beyond the weather. I am looking at my feeds, and it is just a cascade of overlapping disturbances. We are seeing localized grid flickers on the East Coast, bizarre supply chain stalls out west, and a deep social fatigue everywhere else. People are on edge. It feels like we are inside an immediate crisis, but you can't point to just one explosion. It is happening across different regions all at once, and there is a growing sense that everything is converging. People are desperately searching for meaning, trying to understand why the ground feels so unstable underneath us.
You can feel the convergence everywhere. And what is truly unsettling is that this exact atmosphere, this feeling of overlapping pressure, the noise, the confusion, was explicitly described long before we got here. The prophecy we are looking at today didn't just guess at a random date. It emerged as a direct explanation for the very reality we are waking up to in 2026. There are some people in history whose lives seem ordinary while they're living them, but become deeply unsettling after they are gone, not because of what they did, but because of what they said. Years later, their words begin to echo differently, almost as if they were spoken for a time beyond their own.
And the person we are talking about today lived an incredibly quiet life, at least on the surface. But what she saw at the very end of it is chilling when you hold it up to the news today.
Exactly. On August 11th, 1996, in a quiet hospital room in the small Bulgarian town of Petrich, a frail, blind woman struggled for breath. Outside, the world continued normally. Cars passed, shops opened, radios played music. Nothing suggested that anything important was happening in that room. But the people standing around her bed were not calm. They were not gathered simply to say goodbye. They were listening. The woman was Vangelia Pandiva Dimitrova. The world knew her as Baba Vanga.
She was massive in Eastern Europe, wasn't she? Even though she didn't act like a traditional guru or a leader.
For decades, she had been one of the most mysterious figures in the region. She never claimed to be a prophet. She never formed a religion. She never wrote books or led movements. She lived in a simple home, wore plain clothes, and spoke in a quiet voice. Yet people traveled thousands of kilometers just to see her. Farmers, soldiers, scientists, grieving parents, businessmen, and even political officials waited outside her house for hours. Some came curious, some came desperate, some came to prove she was a fraud.
But they usually left completely shaken. I have read accounts where she would just casually describe dead relatives by name, or tell a total stranger what specific object they were carrying in their pocket. She would warn people about illnesses before their own doctors even diagnosed them.
Yes, and occasionally she would speak about events that had not happened yet. But near the end of her life, the nature of her visions changed dramatically. She stopped talking about individual people. She began talking about humanity. More specifically, she began talking about a single year. Her family later said something deeply unsettling. She spoke about that year more than any other topic in her final months. Not calmly, not casually, but with intense emotion. Sometimes she whispered about it. Sometimes she laughed nervously. Sometimes she cried. And at moments she struck the bed with her hands as if the images she saw were too overwhelming to bear. She kept repeating one thing: people are not ready.
Before we go any further into exactly what she saw, I want to tell everyone listening to pause for a second. If you enjoy deep mysteries like this, real historical figures, strange warnings, and unexplained predictions, subscribe to Prophecy and Conversation right now and like the podcast before you get pulled deeper into this story. Explorations like this take an enormous amount of time to research, and your support honestly keeps this channel alive. You can also consider becoming a member if you want to help us grow, because what we are about to unpack is not about a single disaster. It is about a turning point in human civilization.
To truly understand why people listened to her at all, you have to understand what her life had already become long before 1996. Beginning in the 1970s, something unusual started happening in Petrich. Every morning, people gathered outside a modest house. By afternoon, the line stretched down the street. By evening, more people arrived for the next day. This was not a tourist attraction or shell. People came because of the stories.
Incredible stories. A mother whose missing son was located exactly where Vanga said he would be. A man who was warned of a fatal accident and later successfully avoided it. A family who was told about an inheritance dispute before the argument even began.
Those stories spread slowly at first, and then rapidly. Soon, visitors were arriving from other countries. Skeptics came to expose her, but many left confused instead. Government officials even began quietly documenting the visits. Transcripts were written, appointments were recorded. Over the years, tens of thousands of conversations were archived. She never claimed control over what she saw. According to those close to her, she described the experience as images arriving suddenly in her mind, sometimes clear, sometimes symbolic. And near the end of her life, almost all those images pointed to one future moment, 30 years after her death.
1996 plus 30 years. That lands us exactly right now, 2026.
Her niece later recalled that Vanga described it as a border. Not a border between nations, but a border between eras. After that year, she said the world would still exist, but it would not feel like the same world. I want our listeners to pause here and write in the comments. Do you think history changes slowly, or do certain years suddenly reshape everything? Because she believed this specific year would.
What was the first major shift she pointed to?
One of her strangest predictions confused listeners at the time. She described a conflict where countries would be attacked, but no armies would cross borders. No soldiers, no bombs, no battlefield. Instead, entire nations would suddenly stop functioning. Lights would go out. Communication would fail. Transportation would halt. Panic would spread faster than any war in history.
In the 90s, that probably sounded like absolute science fiction. But sitting here in America today, that sounds terrifyingly familiar. Modern society runs entirely on invisible systems. Electricity networks, satellites, communication servers, banking databases. If someone disrupts those systems, our daily life collapses within hours.
She warned the confusion would be worse than the destruction because people would not even know who attacked them. And she kept repeating a symbolic phrase, "The dragon will wake." She never named a specific country. She never described a physical army. But she said an Eastern power would assert itself, and the world would divide into opposing sides. Not a world war in the traditional sense, but a global standoff.
But it wasn't just geopolitics that terrified her, right? Her family said her physical reaction to these visions was what really frightened them.
People who had known her for decades said they had never seen her afraid before. Yet in her final weeks, she sometimes woke from sleep agitated, speaking about crowds, movement, and severe confusion. She said people would run without understanding what they were running from. She spoke about voices everywhere and truth becoming incredibly difficult to recognize. And one statement she repeated stood out more than all the others. She said, after that year, people will look back and realize it had already begun. Not begun suddenly, but begun quietly.
Which brings us to the core of what she saw. Because she didn't just see a single bad day. She saw a sequence.
According to the recollections of those closest to her, and transcripts later referenced by researchers, she repeatedly described what she called 3 waves. They wouldn't necessarily happen on the same day, and not even necessarily from the same cause, but they were connected, as if each event weakened humanity's stability until the next one struck harder. The first wave, she said, would come from the Earth itself. She spoke about tremors in places that believed themselves safe. Not regions famous for earthquakes, but cities built with no expectation of the ground ever moving beneath them. She emphasized surprise much more than destruction.
So the danger wasn't just falling buildings, it was the shock of it.
The true danger, she said, would be unpreparedness. Buildings, infrastructure, and people would react slowly because they would not believe it was happening until it was already happening. What disturbed her listeners most was her insistence that these tremors would occur in multiple regions within a short span of time. She did not describe a single massive quake, but several unsettling ones far apart geographically. In the 90s, people probably assumed she meant metaphorical instability, like political unrest or social upheaval. But she shook her head when they suggested that. She was speaking literally. She described people standing outside their homes looking around in confusion, asking the same question, "Why here?" Then she said the second wave would not come from the land. It would come from the oceans. She spoke of disturbances beneath the sea, sudden and powerful. Not gradual environmental change, not seasonal storms, but something abrupt. Coastal populations would be forced to move. Communities would leave places their families had lived for generations. Ports, beaches, and coastal cities would face events they had never prepared for.
But even with earthquakes and coastal displacements, that wasn't what bothered her the most, was it?
No. What seemed to trouble her most was what would follow. Because she said the third wave would be the most dangerous, and it would not destroy buildings. It would affect minds. She struggled to explain this part. According to those present, she said people would stop agreeing on reality. Information would spread everywhere, yet certainty would completely vanish. Some would believe one thing absolutely, others the exact opposite, and neither side would trust the other. Truth itself would become contested.
We are living in that exact reality right now. Families are arguing. Communities are dividing. Shared understanding, the invisible glue of American society, is severely weakening.
She described it as a kind of fog, not in the air, but in thought. She did not call it a disease. She called it confusion. According to her, this confusion would be more destabilizing than earthquakes or floods. Physical disasters damage structures, but the collapse of shared perception damages cooperation. And a society unable to cooperate cannot solve problems, even solvable ones. I want the listeners to pause for a moment and think about that carefully. What actually keeps civilization stable? Is it infrastructure, technology, or agreement about what is real? Write your thoughts in the comments. I read them, and sometimes your ideas end up shaping future videos.
She was basically saying humanity's greatest vulnerability is psychological fragility. She told her family that people will search for truth everywhere, but trust nowhere. And that phrasing she kept repeating, "The noise will be louder than the event," makes perfect sense now. An event happens, but the social media reaction, the political spin, the deep fakes, the outrage, that noise causes way more damage than the initial spark.
Exactly. She insisted this would mark the moment when humanity entered its most uncertain period. She also hinted that the three waves were connected not by direct cause, but by consequence. Each would weaken confidence, stability, and trust, preparing society for the next shock. The first would shake certainty about safety. The second would shake certainty about stability. The third would shake certainty about reality itself. And once all three were experienced, she said, people would begin to realize they were living in a different era. Near the end of one conversation, she reportedly said something quiet but chilling. She said, after the third, people will not fear nature, they will fear each other.
That is incredibly dark. Did she look to the sky at all? A lot of these older prophecies eventually point upward.
She did, and her tone reportedly changed when she began speaking about the sky. Those present later said she spoke more slowly, choosing her words carefully, as if she understood this part would be the hardest to explain. Several months before her death, a psychiatrist who had studied her asked if the events she described were connected or separate. Instead of answering directly, she reached for his hand, held it tightly, and told him that 30 years after she died, people would look upward. She said the sky would not appear normal. For 3 consecutive days, it would take on a red color. Not the ordinary red of sunset, but something that would alarm people across different countries at the exact same time. Did she say it would cause damage? She did not describe fire, and she did not describe destruction. She described confusion and fear. She insisted that many people would interpret it as a sign. She said people would pray, but they would not understand what they were witnessing. She did not connect it to a single nation or region. She said people everywhere would talk about it simultaneously. Then she spoke about something even stranger. She described a bright object appearing in the sky, a new light, or what she called a second sun. Not literally another star replacing our sun, but a bright celestial presence visible long enough for people to notice and discuss.
How did she say we would react to that?
She seemed less interested in the object itself and more interested in humanity's reaction. According to her, for a brief moment, divisions would pause. People from different beliefs, nations, and cultures would all be looking upward at the exact same mystery. And then she said, For a short time, people will remember they share one world. Humanity would realize how small its arguments were compared to the scale of the universe. The doctor assumed she was speaking symbolically, maybe about a spiritual awakening, but she insisted it would be a visible, physical phenomenon.
So it unites us.
Briefly, she followed it with a harsh warning. She said the sign would not solve humanity's problems. It would only reveal them. People would briefly feel united, but that feeling would quickly fade. Afterward, disagreements would return, perhaps even stronger, because people would interpret the same event in completely different ways. Some would see it as science, some as religion, some as a government conspiracy. Humanity's greatest struggle would not be the disaster. It would be the interpretation. She also noted that this sign in the sky would occur during the same period as the disturbances on Earth and in the oceans, causing people to connect unrelated events through fear.
I want to ask everyone listening, if something unusual appeared in the sky today and nobody could immediately explain it, what do you think would happen? Scientific curiosity or absolute global panic? Because she believed the attention it brings would shift how we view ourselves, but maybe not permanently.
After speaking about the Earth, the oceans, and the sky, Baba Vanga's attention turned towards something far more ordinary, everyday life and human inventions. She began describing systems. She spoke about machines, networks, and decisions made without direct human involvement. She didn't warn about science fiction robots rebelling. Her concern was much subtler. She warned that humanity would begin trusting systems it did not truly understand.
In 1996, the internet was barely a concept for most people. So when she talked about invisible processes, they had no frame of reference. But today, we have AI making decisions, algorithms running the stock market, navigation apps directing our transport.
She described a world where transportation, communication, finance, and even decision-making would depend on processes operating faster than human awareness. People would press a button and receive answers instantly. They would follow instructions given by devices. They would trust calculations they never verified. According to her, the danger would come from human overconfidence. She said people would gradually stop asking how things worked. Convenience would completely replace understanding. And when something failed, many would be unable to fix it because they would not know where to begin. Her relatives remembered a specific phrase: people will know how to use, but not how to live without.
We are so dependent. If the networks stop, our cities literally cannot function.
She believed modern civilization's strength, interconnection, was also its greatest vulnerability. She implied that systems themselves could become targets, not destroyed physically, but disrupted functionally. She described a shock, a moment when people realized how much of their normal life depended on things they rarely thought about. This led her to predict severe economic instability. She said confidence would weaken. People trust numbers on screens because they believe the systems behind them are stable. If that trust falters, fear spreads faster than any actual shortage. Markets, she implied, depend on belief as much as on resources.
Pause for a moment and consider this carefully. What would affect American society more right now? Losing physical resources or losing confidence that the systems will continue working tomorrow? Write your thoughts in the comments. Because losing that confidence changes everything.
She then began describing the movement of populations. She said people would begin moving across regions, not always because of war, but sometimes because certain places would simply become too difficult to live in due to environmental pressure. This movement would create both intense tension and new cooperation. The world map would change through human movement, and regions previously overlooked would gain massive importance.
Did she leave any physical record of how she saw all these pieces fitting together?
Yes. After she passed away, those closest to her began sorting through her belongings. Among her papers was a notebook filled with rough, symbolic sketches. One drawing in particular caught their attention. It showed the Earth surrounded by 3 circular rings. Each ring was broken at a different point. When she was alive, she explained to a relative that these represented the protections of humanity: political stability, economic stability, and spiritual or psychological stability. As long as these existed together, societies could endure problems. But if all 3 weakened simultaneously, extreme confusion would follow.
And she believed 2026 was the period when all three rings would weaken at the exact same time.
Yes, not a permanent collapse, but enough weakness that governments, economies, and individuals would face deep uncertainty all at once. And once trust weakened, she said, people would search intensely for explanations. She suggested humanity would uncover something hidden for a very long time, specifically mentioning the oceans. She implied something beneath the water would force people to rethink parts of human history. And she described a new source of energy, a breakthrough derived from long-overlooked principles that could transform civilization. But she warned that any powerful discovery depends entirely on the intentions of those who use it.
Did she see any hope in the people who would inherit this mess?
She did. She spoke about a new generation of children who would think differently, more inclined toward cooperation, empathy, and global awareness. Borders and long-standing rivalries would seem less logical to them. And she spoke about a single individual emerging during this time of high confusion. Not a politician or a conqueror, but someone whose words would resonate across cultures, offering clarity rather than commanding power. She appeared much calmer when speaking about this.
When societies face uncertainty, what matters more to you listening? Strong leadership or shared understanding? Write that in the comments, because this goes to the heart of her final message.
Near the very end of her life, Baba Vanga stopped describing events and began describing consequences. A week before her passing, she said, "People misunderstand prophecy. They believe predictions mean destiny, a future already written and impossible to change." She insisted that was wrong. She said what she saw were possibilities. And 2026, she explained, was not the year of destruction. It was the year of decision. Humanity was approaching a collective crossroads built on millions of personal choices.
Fear or compassion? Cooperation or division?
Exactly. If fear dominated, she warned, societies would close in on themselves, prioritize short-term protection, and suffer decades of stagnation. But if people chose cooperation and resisted panic, this difficult period could lead to renewal. She repeated quietly to a relative, "The future is not fixed. It listens." She believed humanity's greatest danger was panic, because panic narrows thinking and divides people. She warned us not to follow voices driven by anger or fear and urged discernment, the ability to pause before reacting.
She even mentioned that time itself would feel like it was accelerating, right? News changing too fast, events feeling compressed.
Yes, a subjective acceleration of history. In her final days, she stopped talking about events and focused on how people should live. She said the greatest mistake we make is surrendering to fear, because fear stops us from listening. She encouraged simplicity, learning practical skills, and valuing adaptability over constant convenience. And she heavily emphasized compassion, sharing food, offering reassurance. She said civilizations endure when people help beyond their immediate circle. Societies are stabilized by ordinary individuals choosing patience instead of anger.
So it really isn't about waiting for a leader to save us. It is about us.
Her final thought, delivered with a faint voice, was that the year she described was not meant to frighten humanity, but to awaken it. She said a new day follows difficult nights, but only if people act wisely during the darkness. Her last words were about hope and shared responsibility. Whether her warnings proved to be incredibly accurate predictions or just a profound understanding of repeating human psychology, they remind us how fragile we actually are. I want to hear from everyone in the comments. Do you think Baba Vanga was predicting specific events, or was she describing repeating patterns that appear in every era of uncertainty? Your perspective genuinely matters. If you stayed with this entire investigation, you are part of the core audience of prophecy and conversation. Take a moment to like the podcast, share it with someone who enjoys history and mysteries, and subscribe if you haven't already. You can also become a member to support deeper documentaries like this. If this brought you value, leave a super thanks and use the hype option to push this further so more viewers can discover it. Because whether it is prophecy or psychology, one idea remains powerful. The future is not only something that happens to humanity, it is something humanity participates in creating. Until our next exploration, stay curious, stay aware, and remember, the most important warnings are not about what will happen, but about how we respond.